53 years ago, passenger rail in America was on the verge of collapse. After steep competition with the air and automotive industries, and with numerous restrictions that were made in the 1800s and had still not been revised, the government took a good look at passenger rail and essentially went, the biggest bankruptcy in history. What the hell is going on? Oh my god! But soon enough, the new locomotives would finally arrive. The P42, P40, and P32 locomotives. These locomotives were dubbed the Genesis series, and in a decade's time began to slowly but surely take over all long-distance trains and a good few corridor trains. As time went on in the 90s and the F40 started getting phased out, Amtrak began looking for locomotives and rolling stock for their various state-supported services, mainly Amtrak California services and Amtrak Cascade services. Amtrak settled with EMD for the locomotives for both services, with Alstom for Amtrak California's coaches and Talgo for the Amtrak Cascades coaches. Throughout the 90s, brand new EMD F59 PHI locomotives entered service on Amtrak San Joaquin's and Capital Corridor services. These locos were actually owned by the California Department of Transportation, or Caltrans, with them using the reporting mark of CDTX. Caltrans painted these locomotives into a scheme very reminiscent of their own color, with many golds and deep blues, and then a main silver body. Caltrans also bought some new Alstom California cars. These were basically the Superliners, but with some more modern amenities. These cars also featured 8 cab control cars. And in the early 2000s, Amtrak bought 21 F59 PHIs for Cascades and the newly renamed Amtrak Surfliner service. The Cascades F59 PHIs were paired with Talgo train sets that were basically a carbon copy of the ones used in Europe. Cars were always formed in a train set, unlike the California cars. The Surfliner PHIs were paired with new Surfliner cars, another revision on the California cars. These also came with 9 cab cars, with Caltrans buying an additional 3 for Surfliner and 5 for the Northern California services.
You know, it's been a while since we've checked on the Northeast. Let's see how they're doing over there.
It was almost the year 2000, and Amtrak wanted to make that year something big. I mean, like, it wouldn't be happening for another 1,000 years. What would you expect them to do?
So Amtrak looked at the rest of the world with all their nice, fast, and new trains, and looked back at their system, which wasn't bad.
But comparing Amtrak to something like JR is like comparing a microwave dinner to a 5-star meal. The microwave dinner isn't necessarily bad, but it's garbage compared to the 5-star meal. Amtrak wanted to go from a microwave dinner to at least something like a meal prepared at 10 p.m. when I'm just tired and want something to eat.
You see, the difference there is I make good food that isn't frozen.
So, Amtrak decided to jump into the realm of high-speed rail.
Oh crap! He said the H word! Sound the alarm! But because this is Amtrak we're talking about, there's always a catch.
You see, this new high-speed rail would be ran on the existing Northeast Corridor. Just the Northeast Corridor would be fully electrified to Boston and have some speed increases here and there. So, instead of being a true high-speed rail, it was more of a high-speed rail in lowercase Comic Sans with 2 asterisks and quotation marks. For this high-speed rail, Amtrak wanted to be real picky. They liked the Siemens ICE-1 train sets, but they also liked the ABB's X2000 train sets. And they also wanted the tilting feature on Via's LRC train sets by Bombardier. So, Amtrak would not pick Siemens or ABB, rather Alstom, the manufacturer of the train sets used for France's TGV system.
I'm trying to build my shelf here, and I got 2 offers from 2 people who are absolutely amazing at shelf building. I mean, they know how to build a real good shelf. However, I picked this totally unrelated guy instead. Well, yes, I do know that the US safety standards made it so making a high-speed train set for Amtrak at this time was a bit difficult. However, Siemens and ABB both said that they would meet the safety standards if they built Amtrak's train set. So Amtrak's decision to choose Alstom, all because they were kind of related to the guy who made the tilting cars that were really only going to serve as the cars for the train set, was a bit of a weird idea in my opinion.
But after some issues with testing and being called Le Cochon, or the pig, by Alstom workers, the new train sets finally entered service under a new service named the Acela Express. Acela being short for acceleration and excellence. I see we're going at those blatant lies again.
At this point, it was the early 2000s, and Amtrak was flat broke.
Amtrak was getting so little funding that they didn't actually own their own Acela train sets. They were leased to a separate company, and Amtrak just used them to save costs. However, at this time, Amtrak also started retiring the last of their F40 units. But because their shells were still useful, Amtrak started turning some of their retired F40s into cab control baggage units, nicknamed cabbages. Basically, Amtrak went, if 6902 can do it, why not 208? And so, the cabbages went into service. Most of them were in Amtrak's new Phase 5 scheme, but a few were painted into a few state-supported service schemes, with 2 being painted into veterans paint schemes. Specifically, X221, now 9221, and X208, now 9208. Oh wait, 9208.
You know, it's been a bit since we've had a problematic locomotive on our hands. Why don't we add one to the mix, shall we?
Because of the AAM7s going under refurb and just general service increases, Amtrak ordered 15 HHP8 locomotives from Alstom in 1996, with them arriving around the same time as the Acelas in 1999/2000. Now, these locomotives were mostly fine, except one fatal flaw that made these things a pain for Amtrak. The HHP8 name stood for High Horsepower 8000. The issue with the HHP8s was that their horsepower was too high for the locomotive, meaning they often had a lot of wheel slip, meaning they always needed maintenance for their wheels, which wore out very quickly.
Wow, I see problems with an existing model is also on the schedule.
The Acela Express train sets also had major issues in 2005, leading to them all getting called in for maintenance due to extremely bad cracks in their brakes. An issue that was discovered only by chance.
Basically, the manufacturer of the brakes did say to check them regularly, however, apparently this instruction was lost in translation.
I don't know what happened. The instructions that said not to leave my stove on overnight were lost in translation.
My damn house blew up!
Amtrak was extremely lucky that this issue with the brakes was discovered, because it very well could have caused a serious derailment if they left it untouched for any longer.
After this issue with the Acelas was fixed, Amtrak entered another calm period. The Acelas were being an okay form of high-speed rail, the AEM7s, P42s, and F59s were being pretty reliable and overall pretty damn good, and the HHP8s were trying not to shear their reels off.
All was right with Amtrak for the most part. But the AEM7s, despite them being rebuilt a decade earlier, were really starting to show their age, and the HHP8s were being extra silly, as was per usual. Amtrak needed a replacement for these locomotives pretty soon, so Amtrak went for someone they hadn't really dabbled with at all at this point: Siemens. Siemens hadn't really done much in the US by this point. While yes, they did have a stranglehold on the US light rail market, in heavy rail they weren't too present.
But after Alstom tried and failed to make a good AEM7 fill-in, Amtrak decided not to go to Alstom and instead to go to Siemens.
Amtrak liked Siemens' Eurosprinter and Vectron models, so they asked for some weird combination of those with some American modifications.
And so, Siemens started cooking up a locomotive to finally put the AEM7s and HHP8s to rest.
And in 2014, Siemens unveiled the ACS64. And
wow, it only took 14 years, but we finally have a reliable locomotive on our hands. Yep, the ACS64 managed to live up to and even exceed the expectations of a replacement for the AEM7s, and allowed the HHP8s to quietly retire in 2014 and the AEM7s to triumphantly retire in 2016.
After Siemens managed to give Amtrak a pretty good locomotive for the Northeast, Amtrak decided to return to them for what would be a locomotive that would hopefully not just shake up the American passenger rail industry, but bring it into a renaissance. Now, while I do say Amtrak went back to Siemens for this project, in reality, Siemens were the only people who were actually willing to do the project because for some reason EMD, now Progress Rail, just didn't want to, and everyone else was kind of occupied or just also didn't want to, so yep, Siemens it was. And what do you know, the timing for this couldn't be any better, as a new private company named Brightline also wanted a new modern locomotive for their service in Florida to make a good impression. And plus, Siemens locomotives in other countries and in the Northeast were praised for being a dream for operators. So, with this in mind, Amtrak let Siemens once again start cooking up the locomotive that in less than a decade would spread across the US like a wildfire. One that could meet the EPA's strict Tier 4 emission standards and hopefully please Amtrak and Brightline's needs. This locomotive was the Siemens Charger.
After some testing in late 2016 and early 2017, the first Siemens Chargers went into service on Brightline service in Florida and Amtrak's Midwest and Cascade services. But guess what happened? The initial batch of Chargers for Amtrak's Midwest, Cascades, and California services was riddled with issues, ranging from minor to 2117.
Basically, when temperatures would drop, mainly in the Midwest with the Midwest Chargers, the Chargers would have an issue where the oil would freeze up in the engine and snow would build up, due to a wrong material being used for piping, and this would cause the locomotive's computer to detect a fault and shut the entire locomotive, HEP included, down.
Yeah, the initial batch of Chargers had an issue where if the computer in the train detected a fault, the entire locomotive would shut itself down, which, while I can understand that for safety reasons, shutting down the whole locomotive is a bit harsh.
Oh crap, I spilled soda on my bed. Well, time to throw it out. After this, Amtrak basically went, Siemens, what the hell is this? And over the latter half of the 2010s and the early 2020s, Amtrak sent Siemens 70 modifications. Wow! But because Amtrak had to be Amtrak, they suddenly remembered, crap, we need to replace the P42s. Hey, Siemens, I know you're working on those modifications, but can you also make us 125 long-distance Chargers and some new coaches to be delivered in 2021? Okay, thanks, bye.
Because of this, the first batch of ALC-42s that Amtrak received had all of the freezing issues, software issues, etc.
But thankfully, by late 2023, Siemens had finally received the full list of modifications Amtrak sent them, and now the Chargers that started being built in around 2022/2023 were a lot more reliable than the ones previous, and a good few chokers had began getting fixed. A good way to tell a old Charger model and a new Charger model is with Coaster down here in San Diego and Brightline in Florida, which both got caught in the middle of this change. Basically, half of their Chargers are the old model and the other half are the new model, and for those who actually care, there is a visible difference, mainly the horn and the lights. Remember when I mentioned those coaches? Well, Amtrak Midwest and Amtrak San Joaquin's received a brand new order of Siemens Venture coaches. However, because of Amtrak's luck, the Ventures had some issues in testing, but thankfully managed to go into service in 2021 for Amtrak Midwest and 2024 for Amtrak San Joaquin's. Also, if you're wondering what was going on with Brightline through all these problems, they got a maintenance contract with Siemens, so the people who actually work with Siemens can actually fix their locomotives, so they got an easy way out with the Chargers.
And as if Amtrak wasn't done, they went to Siemens and said,
hey, we like those new Ventures, you want to make some to replace all of our Amfleet 1 coaches?
Basically what happened here was Siemens went from basically just serving as GE's replacement in the Northeast to serving as the replacement to GE, EMD, and BUD in all regions, making what those companies would have made had they still been working with Amtrak at this time or still just straight up existed.
Yeah, Amtrak wanted a replacement for their ancient Amfleet 1 coaches, and also the Amtrak Cascades Talgo sets that, due to a derailment in 2017, were deemed unsafe by the Washington State Department of Transportation. So they had Siemens go ahead and make replacements for all of those, with a good few of these sets having cab cars to make it easier for them to turn around. And to add on to this, Amtrak also ordered a batch of ALC-42E dual-mode locomotives to run on the Northeast Corridor. Wait. So Amtrak, what was the point of the ACS-64s? This is one of the main things I really don't get. Amtrak, who has a full fleet of ACS-64 locomotives, has Siemens make dual-mode chargers. Now you're probably thinking, well, dual-mode chargers are only for the Northeast Corridor services that go beyond the electrified segment. But that's the thing. Most Northeast Corridor services go beyond the electrified segment. So, instead of Amtrak doing this first, they had Siemens make a whole electric locomotive only for them to turn around and say, wait, we want dual mode instead. Now, I've been talking a whole lot about Siemens, and this Siemens rabbit hole goes so deep I could make a whole nother video on it. So, let's go over to the one new thing for Amtrak that wasn't by Siemens. Rather, Siemens' biggest competitor in the modern day, Alstom. Oh boy, here we go. What is by far the NEC's biggest headache yet? The Alstom Avalia Liberties.
In 2016, Amtrak announced that they would be working with Alstom to produce a replacement to the aging Acela 1 sets known as the Acela 2 sets, also known as the Avalia Liberty.
Alright, it's basically confirmed. What went wrong? Alstom rushed the design phase of the new train sets, making them so unreliable that they missed their service start date by so far that I can't even say when they went into service because they aren't even in service yet by the making of this video. The Avalias have so many issues that they could warrant their own video, and many people have made videos on the absolute mess these things have been for Amtrak. But if you want a rundown for it, let's just say early corrosion and weathering and windows spontaneously shattering and pantographs bouncing and other issues like that are among some of the many issues these poor train sets have faced. But the fact that Amtrak has had to start cannibalizing the other Acela 1 sets to use parts for the other Acela 1 sets to stay in service shows how the Avalias being delayed this much was nowhere near part of the plan. But, with all that being said, this all leads us to today.
And despite the issues with Siemens and Alstom, Amtrak's future is still looking surprisingly bright.
Amtrak has plans for replacing extremely old structures in the Northeast, replacing its Superliner coaches, and finally modernizing its whole fleet so it can at least look like that 5-star dinner. In the end, however, Amtrak was simply created to save American passenger rail, but because of how poorly it was handled in the 70s and 80s, the time when it was supposed to be making strides in saving passenger rail's image, Amtrak has lasted for now 53 years. Meaning that at this point, with how much Amtrak has solidified, it's going to be a while until it leaves like it was supposed to about 38 years ago. So, for now, we get to enjoy the National Railroad Passenger Corporation for all it's worth. Even if it has some of the worst luck with locomotives and train sets I have ever seen!